I know you're a big Trump fan, so I hope you don't mind that I had a couple of satirical images in there.
No, there's no problem. I this is as I started explaining. This is the first um, thing I've tried to do on my new computer. For some reason, it does have one of those things that's supposed to be able to do the photo zoom kind of thing, but it's not doing it. So we're connected to my phone, so that's the way it
Looks
goes.
good. I can hear you.
Okay.
Um, Ladies and gentlemen, George Wuerthner is the author of this, which we're going to read today. And you've written a lot of great stuff, and you continue to crank out stuff. In fact, the Wildlife News has so much good stuff, and it's going to we're going to cross some topics here because, as you know, we're facing a new issue in Point Reyes National Seashore with handing over management to the TNC. And the Wildlife News has written about the TNC and is very familiar with the problems with TNC. And is it fair for me to say that they're kind of like posing as a nature organization when in fact they are not, or am I going too far?
No, I think that they for years, if you looked at their board of directors, they would tend to have the leaders of major timber companies,
Yep.
oil and gas companies, and so
Wow.
forth. So that has influenced
Jeez.
the direction of TNC. I mean, when they save some little parcel of land, you got to say it's a good thing. But a lot of times they tend to support exploitation of the land as well, and that sends a mixed message out to the public because they have so much money behind them, and they have so much, sort of goodwill because of some of these areas that they've protected. That people naturally assume that if they say, "Oh, it's good to log the forest" or "It's good to graze the landscape," and people assume that, who knows better than the Nature Conservancy, and that's a
Right.
problem.
Right. And prior to the Nature Conservancy, who knows better than Park Service, or who knows better than the scientists at UC Berkeley?
Right.
Yeah. We got misinformation coming from a lot of directions. And with that note, let me throw this up. This was at a what I call a propaganda fest that took place in Marin that featured a lot of stuff pushing the importance of cattle grazing and why we need cattle grazing in Point Reyes National Seashore. So here we have someone like you, I'll call a seasoned veteran who's actually out in the field and observing, like I do as an amateur, observing that all these claims just aren't true. And it's being pushed by Point Reyes National Seashore, the Nature Conservancy, and the ranchers.
Well, let me respond. Can I respond to that
Please.
beginning right there? you know, like a lot of these things, there's an element of truth in it, but it's what they don't say that's important. For example, if you graze something really hard down to dirt, yes, that will have an influence on fire spread. The problem is you can't do that over a whole landscape without having significant collateral damage
Mm-hmm.
that affects a whole lot of other things in the ecosystem. So it's misleading to say that. I don't know if we'll get to this later, so I'll mention it right now. There's a research paper from the University of Arizona Range Department where they, go into saying how grazing can reduce the intensity and severity of wildfire spread. And, they go through the whole thing, and it's based one thing on modeling, not actual going out and measuring, the results after a fire. But the other thing at the very end, the second to last paragraph, they say, our results only apply to low to moderate fire situations, not extreme fire situations. And extreme fire situations, and this is a very important point for people to get, those are the only fires that are significant because
Yeah.
under low to moderate fire conditions, most fires self-extinguish after going burning a few acres at most. So
Right.
so this idea that grazing is an a way to reduce large fires, which are the ones that people are worried about. Those are the things that would overrun your community and so forth. To say that in the next to last paragraph, so they cover their behinds from any criticism from people like me. But most people never read the whole paper through. They just see the abstract. Oh, grazing will reduce fires, and that gets widely cited. And so a lot of times you have to look at how these articles are, put together. In other words, the research premises and assumptions. So that's my comment.
And how about just the fact that in a scientific paper, it's including the word "can"? So you're not bringing much to the table if you have to include the word "can," because that's not tangible. That's hypothetical. It's like, hey, this can. And you already pointed out that we're not even talking about the intense fires, which get pushed because, forget nature, forget ecology, forget the wildlife. Saving our homes is the top priority.
Right.
And so you milk the fear factor, and it is extreme fires that burn homes. It's not moderate fires that burn homes. And yet this article or this publication is talking about moderate fires and not extreme fires. And in addition to that, all they can do is say "can." They don't say "will" or "has proven." It says "can."
Well, let me respond so people understand why the extreme fires. The criteria that you have to have an extreme fire are drought, which we've got mega drought going on all over the West right now, sometimes decades long. But then you have higher temperatures, which we also have because of climate change, and low humidity. But the really significant factor is wind. And high winds will blow embers miles ahead of a fire front, which is why this whole strategy, whether it's logging the forest, doing prescribed burning, doing grazing, or whatever the solution is, typically fails, because we cannot reduce fuels. And even if we could, fuels are not the issue, because the wind will blow embers to anything that's burnable. I've watched fires when there's a 40-mile-an-hour wind blowing, where there's stubble like 1 inch high, and that 1 inch high stubble is still carrying the fire. Now, maybe the flagging lengths aren't as high in that particular area, but as soon as they hit, sooner or later they hit more fuel, and then it takes off. So you cannot, the Forest Service or the BLM, when they're fighting fires, do not put firefighters in front of a wind-driven fire, because the embers can blow over the firefighters and then trap them with a fire in front and a fire in back. And that is the reason why most of these solutions to fires fail. And they're all aimed at the less extreme fire situation, I should say. When they're pronounced to be effective, they are effective under the less extreme fire situation. Sometimes, I have to put that in, not always. Yeah. But they don't work on these extreme fire conditions. And those are the ones that are the real threat to communities and anything else out there. So
I have two images to throw on the screen that relate to what you just said. This was not published by the Wildlife News, but this is you somewhere else talking about propaganda being pushed about obviously they wanted to talk about the positive effects of prescribed burning, and you countered this. Now, I'm going to throw the other image up, and then we can circle back and you can comment on both of them. We were talking about fire fuels, and this one from the publication you did that is the focus of today. You're showing trees standing and a home burnt to the ground, and the caption says this was a grass fire. That's pretty important. Yeah. There's a lot to talk about in this image alone, right?
Yep. Yeah.
Go ahead, take it.
Well, a couple of things. The first one about the prescribed burning saving sisters, when you read the incident report, you find out that the fire, that particular fire, had burned through several previous fires, and so that's a fuel reduction. It had burned through some hazardous fuel reductions, which means thinning or logging. It had burned through some previous prescribed burns, and then it got to one prescribed burn, and it seemed to stop there. And so they ignored all those other fuel reductions that did stop the fire and proclaimed that, prescribed burning saved this town of Sisters. But when you read the incident report, you find out that the weather was changing at the point that the fire reached that prescribed burn. And as the weather changes, a lot of times you have people will know this. When the weather changes, a lot of times there's this calm before the storm, so to speak. In other words, the winds are changing direction and so forth, and you get almost no wind. And that's what happened. So at that point, the fire, the prescribed burn appeared to slow the fire's advance. And then the wind changed 180 degrees direction and blew it back through the previous burns and prescribed burns and up into a lava field. And they declared, look at how this saved the city of Sisters. And the other one picture was a fire near Bozeman, Montana. And it was the same thing. It burned through some trees in place, but then it got down in the valley, and it continued to burn across irrigated pastures and the kinds of things that should stop a fire. But it didn't, because the wind was blowing embers. And what you see is that this house, for example, and I forget how many houses were burned in this fire, but there were a number of them, 20 or 30 of them. And the situation was that the grass fire burned up to the house, and there was something flammable about the house. I don't know what it was, because all I'm seeing is the foundation. But the embers were blown across all these other low fuel, quote, places, and still wound up burning up the house. And the thing about grass fires that we'll have to realize is that grass fires are what we call flashy fuel. In other words, they burn very rapidly. They're easy to ignite because they dry out real quickly, and so they can really carry a fire very quickly and overwhelm any kind of this fire, for example, that's in the picture, crossed a number of highways, etc., and paved roads. Well, there's no fuel on those highways or paved roads, and yet that didn't stop the fire either. So why would something like a prescribed burn stop the fire when there is still, even after prescribed burn, usually some sort of fuel base left? And the other thing with the prescribed burns that's problematic, that's never admitted, is that oftentimes, if you're going to do a prescribed burn, you have to do it over and over and over again, what we call maintenance, because within a few years, and it varies with the ecosystem, but anywhere from 1 to 10 years, you will get regrowth that is as much or greater biomass than existed before you did the fire. I have seen this over and over again, where they do a prescribed burn and they burn up shrubs that are less flammable than maybe even the grass, but then they replace it with just grass. And so the grass becomes even more flammable and more likely to carry a fire in the future. So when they do a prescribed burn, you got to ask them, how long are you going to do this? Do you have the money to continue to do this? Is this something you're going to continue on? Because if you're not, you may be making things worse than you had before.
Similar to the prescribed burns with targeted grazing or with whatever fire fuel reduction grazing, all of these programs don't have an end date or a goal accomplished date attached to them. It's just perpetual grazing. That's always bothered me. Why don't people ever expect there to be a date for when, which, by the way, these are very expensive programs that we, the taxpayers, are paying for. Wouldn't you like to know when this is going to be completed?
Right. Well, of course, as you're insinuating, a lot of these things are used as an excuse to continue exploitation, like grazing, and without looking at the long-term costs. So just hypothetically, let's say I was willing to agree that grazing could reduce fuels. Okay. Do we have to graze, millions of acres to do that? And is it going to be successful if you do that? Well, it won't be, because of the issues that I mentioned before, the regrowth as well as the landscape scale of things. You can't do that. It's the same thing with fire breaks. I have lots of pictures, well, fire breaks like a highway is obvious, but where the BLM is going and bulldozing on the side of roads and trying to eliminate the plant life there. And and another thing people need to be aware of is a lot of times when you disturb the landscape like that, whether it's with cows, whether it's with bulldozers or whatever, you often invite colonization by more flammable fuels like cheatgrass.
Absolutely.
And cheatgrass is an annual grass that dries out early and becomes more flammable than the original grasses that are there. So you often make it actually a more likely to burn in the future. Again, unless you can keep that down. I was on a field trip with some ranchers in Idaho one time, and the BLM was trying to get the ranchers to graze to create a fire break by grazing it very heavily, so there was no fuel left. But the way the BLM wanted it done, they wanted just along the corridor along a road on either side of the road, like 100 feet or something like that, or a couple hundred feet. And the rancher said, "There's no way I want to do this." I was surprised they were honest. But they said, "We can't afford to truck our cattle in here and try to control them." In other words, that's the other question. How do you keep them within that 200-foot, space or something? You either got to put up fencers or you got to have range riders out there constantly chasing the cows or whatever. We cannot afford to do it like that. And so the option that the BLM chooses say, well, you can graze this whole, allotment, and we'll hope that it'll, become a fire barrier. And so anyway, that's, there's a lot of nuance to all these plans that you hear, and it's a lot of happy talk. And the unfortunate thing, and I want to blame often the media for this, is it's in a way it's not their fault, but a lot of the people that are writing, for newspapers, etc., don't know enough about fire ecology and the nuances here to ask even the right questions. And so they just, the ranchers or the BLM or whoever is the experts. So they quote what they have to say and are not aware that there may be more to it than they're hearing.
Yeah. I mean, as a semi-intelligent species, I'll give us that much, semi-intelligent species, we should be asking the basic question of, is there some sort of a financial incentive for these people to possibly skew the information? I mean, when you're being paid to graze.
That's exactly it. Follow the money. In so many cases, you'll find that there is a financial interest there. And, certainly when it comes to grazing on public lands, why would ranchers want to continue? The average audience won't know. So I'll tell you, because grazing on public lands, the charge from federal agencies to graze, and state agencies, by the way, too, to graze on public lands is usually far less than it would cost to graze a similar, ecologically similar piece of land that's privately owned. And so if you can graze the public lands, you're getting a really good deal. You're not, for example, you don't have to pay taxes on that land. That's just one simple thing. You get a lot of the infrastructure either paid for or shared by the public. In other words, the public will pay to put in fencing. The public will pay to put in watering troughs or pipelines, and all of that at taxpayer expense. Or even simple things like, okay, say there's a campground, and obviously people don't want cows, crapping all over the campground. So then the BLM or the Forest Service will fence the campground to keep the cows out, but we pay for that. In other words, the taxpayers pay to keep somebody else's cows from, making the campground filthy. So there's lots and lots of ways that that public lands grazing is subsidized, and that is why ranchers who have access to public lands allotments fight so hard to continue it. And then there's a further incentive that most people don't know about. And that is when you have, this is the money thing. When you have access to public lands and you go to a bank, this is not true of every, situation that somebody's grazing with public lands allotment, but a lot of banks will loan you money based on the value of that public lands access. So you don't even own the land, but the banks recognize that this increases the value of your ranch because you have this public lands access. So if you
Wow.
need money or you want to borrow money, you can. So you even have banks in places fighting against any reduction in grazing on public lands because they are holding the you might say the lease on this indirectly through their loans. So there's these things are all piled on top of each other, and it's a
I'm going to
lot.
bring this. I'm going to bring this back to Point Reyes because a lot of my audience are Point Reyes people. You talked about the financial incentive for them. It might be even more extreme inside of Point Reyes National Seashore, where they are actually getting away with criminally cheap leases. Criminally cheap leases. Not just getting the incentives that you talked about, but they're already paying next to nothing to be there in the first place, plus getting these other advantages that you're talking about. And then you have the TNC step in, and the ranchers have poised this as evil environmentalists kicking out small working families, when in fact it seems more like the TNC is working with the ranchers, gave them a payout, and the ranchers aren't leaving. They're still grazing. In fact, they're paying one of the ranchers that voluntarily chose to stay. They're paying him additional money to engage in this targeted grazing. This is all pro ranching, people. This is not, it's not much of a win, in my opinion, for environmentalists.
Yeah, well, let me you mentioned targeted grazing. Let me explain a little bit about the problems with that. This is what happens when you get focused on one thing, like trying to reduce fires, and ignore all the collateral damage that can go with it. So one of the collateral damages with grazing is the destruction of soil crusts, for example. And soil crusts are very important to, well, they put atmospheric nitrogen back into the soil. They hold the soil together against erosion, whether it's wind and water erosion, and they are an important aspect of grasslands that are largely ignored. But there's all sorts of other things. The disturbance that happens, like I mentioned earlier, tends to favor weedy annual species like the cheatgrass, or in a lot of parts of California, wild oats, and that are given a benefit through the trampling and the grazing that results from the destruction of that soil structure. And then you get soil compaction, which tends to make water run off quicker, and then you get more sedimentation in streams. And then you have the water pollution that results. And you correct me, Skylar, you would know more about this than me, but as I recall, one of the most polluted streams in California coastal areas was coming off of Point Reyes when it was being grazed by all the cattle before.
Streams and beaches both won that award.
Yeah. So anyway, that's another cost that's ignored, is the water pollution that results. There is the displacement of native species. A lot of native species don't like to be in the same place as cattle. And there's multiple studies that show, for example, that unless they're desperate, elk won't graze in the same place that there's cattle. They move somewhere else. And if one assumes that they want to graze where the cattle is, that's why they were there, because it was good for whatever reason, better nutrition, better, less predator, whatever. They're being pushed into less desirable conditions. You have all the other collateral damage that goes with livestock production, like predator control. Ranchers don't want wolves, they don't want coyotes, etc., so they kill the predators. We don't count that. There is the killing of pests, so to speak. I don't know if this happens at Point Reyes, but in other places they poison prairie dogs, they poison ground squirrels and so forth to eliminate competition with cattle. And then there is the whole aspect of fences that are barriers for the free movement of wildlife back and forth. So I could go on and on, but those are all unaccounted costs that are ignored when people promote the cattle grazing for whatever reason. And I'm
gonna say a few things. People who are watching, it's a special opportunity to have George here. If you have questions, if you have any challenging questions regarding the propaganda of fire fuel reduction and the use of cattle grazing, this is your time to put them in the comments. This is a great chance to ask those and have George answer them. Someone, a coast writer, talked about it doesn't keep them off Tomales beaches. You were talking about the campgrounds and the fences, and I immediately thought about Dillon Beach, where I have camped, and the cattle are right up next to your tent. I mean, they give the ranchers absolutely every inch that they can, and as you just pointed out, we paid for that fence, most likely. And one more thing to say, you brought up quote unquote pests, which were never pests until humans arrived with their commodity animals. And some of the people who are actually on the side of wildlife, instead of pretending to be like the Nature Conservancy, want the reintroduction of a few animal species to Point Reyes National Seashore, including some burrowing animals of the rodent variety. And it turns out that ranchers, which is the same thing as where I grew up, eradicated these animals because they're a potential problem for their livestock, stepping in holes and breaking their legs, etc. So, oh, well, we can't have those naturally occurring ground burrowing species here because of our commodity animals. And I've thought many times about, why isn't that a problem for deer? Why isn't that a problem for elk? And why doesn't anybody talk about that?
Yeah, well,
It's a great example that these people that want to pretend that cattle are a replacement for native ungulates, they're not. They're obviously different. And
well,
we've got to talk about the soil crusts, because someone's got to have in the back of their mind, why aren't native animals destroying soil crusts, as you said that cattle are destroying soil crusts. Okay, I'll shut up. I gave you a lot there to work with.
well, the part of it is that the density of cattle that are on allotments is usually much higher than the historic numbers of native species that were there. Plus the seasonality of use. Now, you wouldn't probably it's not as specialized maybe at Point Reyes as other places, but for example, in a lot of other parts of California or in the Rocky Mountains in the arid West, the native species migrate and move around with the seasons. And they are up in the higher country in the summer, which gives at that time they're grazing the plants as they're moving on. They're not spending a lot of time in the same area, is my point. Whereas cattle are fenced in and they don't have that mobility, that ability to move seasonally. The other thing that in terms of the soil crust aspect is that the soil crusts can be they kind of go dormant. When there's not a lot of moisture, and then they're very fragile. You can break them apart at that point with hooves, and so that's one of the issues for soil crusts and having high concentration. And cattle are just way bigger than a deer. The footprint from a deer is smaller than it is even an elk than from cattle, and the pounds per square inch from cattle is much more on soil compaction and so forth. So those are some of the issues for the soil crust. But one more thing I wanted to mention, Skylar, too, that people ignore is, again, it has to do with soil. A lot of the native bee species that you have around the West are soil, they nest in the soil. And soil compaction can collapse their burrows, can destroy their nesting habitat. Plus, when you have cattle or sheep grazing all the flowers, you're taking away their sources of nectar as well. And that's, I don't know hardly anybody who ever talks about, what is cattle grazing doing for butterflies, for bees, for all these native pollinators that are essential to the rest of the ecosystem in terms of pollination, and even frankly, those native bees do some pollination in domestic areas. I was looking at, I have in my little yard here, I have planted quite a number of native shrubs and so forth. And the other day I was looking at one, I saw 3 species of bumblebees out there in my yard. and I try to encourage native species in my yard. I put logs on the ground because some live in logs. I have I actually have this like 2x4 that I drilled holes in, and some of the native bees they nest in that over winter, and and then the new bees come out in the spring. Anyway, the point being that the effects of grazing can harm some of those species and their pollination and have an impact again on the whole ecosystem.
I see some questions coming in from people. I'm going to put them up on the screen in a minute. This publication of yours, that is the focal point of today, did talk about dormancy. It wasn't so much about the dormancy of the soil crust, but native grasses or other native life, that while they're in a dormant stage, you have these non-native plants starting up and consuming resources. And my God, what another topic, just the resource consumption of these non-natives, because everywhere I go, I'm now observing the speed at which different plants grow, and that, which by the way throws a huge hole in this targeted grazing conversation, because it's as if all plants grow at the exact same time, and if you send cattle in, then you're done. But no, that's not how it works. But the speed at which these non-natives are growing, I'm looking at them now and I'm thinking, my God, you must be consuming a lot of resources to grow at this pace. And you have your natives that are meant to be here and therefore behave in a manner, in a more moderate manner, and wait until, as you put, maybe come out of dormancy for their time, and then that's when they would consume resources. Well, not only are those resources not available to them, but they're probably being choked out and shaded out by the plants that aren't supposed to be there and aren't a natural part of that system, regardless of if you came in fact, probably even more so promoted by your fire fuel or vegetation management program, which has, as you, again, in this article, you point out, we have a gradual reduction of the natives and a gradual increase of the non-natives, which are in fact the fire fuel.
Well, yeah, exactly. Let me extrapolate on that just a little bit. A lot of native plants are perennial, which means that they're there year after year. And surprisingly, some of the native bunch grasses and other native grasses that are found throughout the West, you could almost call them old growth species. They'll live 100 years. And when you have a 100-year horizon, you don't have to successfully reseed and establish yourself year after year, because you've got a timetable that if you have a favorable year for seedling establishment every 10 or 20 years, that will perpetuate you on the landscape. So, but the exotics are often annuals that can come and grow year after year. So they are designed to take advantage and exploit water, nutrients, etc. At a time of year. Often, like I'm most familiar with cheatgrass because I've spent a lot of time out in the Great Basin and so forth. But cheatgrass will green up earlier in the spring than the native bunch grasses. So it's using water that would be stored in the soil. It's using nutrients that's stored in the soil that the native grasses would otherwise have available. But when the cheatgrass uses it up, there's less for them. And because the cheatgrass is an annual and its seeds get, when they get germinated, they drop their seeds in the soil. They're sitting there waiting for the next year or the next good year to, go to town, so to speak, and take over the area. And they can take advantage of any particular moisture that is typically in most of the West. We have more moisture after the winter and in the spring than in the summer, because we tend to have summer droughts just naturally. And but the non-native species can green up sooner and then take advantage of that water availability. And that's one of the issues out there for a lot of the native species in terms of their survival. And the other thing with the exotics like that is that they can respond. Even they can take advantage of any kind of bare soil that's created. In others, that's their habitat, is to come in fast when there's any disturbance. Whereas a lot of the native species are, they're kind of like, the way to think about it is like an old growth forest. They're there for a long time, and they're looking for the occasional year where the temperature, where the moisture, and so forth is just right for their seeds to germinate and survive, to take over and perpetuate the species on that landscape. So they have a different ecological strategy, you might say, and that's one of the problems. And then another thing I want to mention about fire related is that a lot of another problem with this whole idea of strategic grazing or prescribed burning is this idea that a lot of the landscape, particularly lower elevation landscape, burn very frequently. That's not true for a whole lot of the West. For example, chaparral do have adaptations to fire, but they can't be burned every year. They need big, long intervals between any major fire. And same with sagebrush. Sagebrush species don't have any adaptation to fire. If they're burned every year, you lose the sagebrush, and in fact, you encourage the growth of things like cheatgrass. Some sagebrush species have a fire rotation of 200 to 400 years. They're not designed to burn every year and or frequently. And so, and when you do all this prescribed burning, or you do this selected targeted grazing, you are countering the native species' ability to survive. And that's one of those misinformation or lack of information that's often not mentioned.
I've got a couple of disturbing images from your publication that I think go along with that. And I think that this image is fires that take place too often affecting,
Right.
and then this is humans not even waiting for fire, just bulldozing that native brush and burning.
Yeah.
Or is that their attempt to stop that fire by
It's probably an attempt to stop the fire. But that's also how they make these quote fuel breaks, which they're trying, the BLM, particularly on low and sagebrush habitat, is doing bulldozing, which of course disturbs the soil. And what you get oftentimes is a lot more cheatgrass coming in on those things. Again, if they did it every year and kept it bare dirt, that would be different. But they don't have the resources to do that, and they don't do that. And also a bulldoze, linear thing that's 20 or 30 or 40 feet wide, if there's wind, the wind's going to blow right across that anyway and set on fire the fuels on the other side.
With that in mind, I observe all the time this flawed plan of get rid of things and then they just leave it at that. And as I think you have indicated, for multiple reasons, the most likely person to, or most likely species to show up in that spot in an opportunity that humans just created are cheatgrasses. And that means that the native fire resistant plants that were moved out of the way because of an attempt to reduce fire fuel issues just gave way to the next generation of ignition fuel. Now, I've got your picture from your publication of a thinning project, which, as your publication also points out, directly benefits the timber industry. So there are incentives there. But with this on the screen, I'm thinking about a comment that was posed by someone who's listening, and we're going to answer some of these questions. And I see Jim Coda is here. He's been working hard on the point raise issue. So we'll get to your question in a moment, Jim. Coast Rider says, is it beneficial to remove the understory fuel in a mixed conifer forest interspersed with oak and madrone? Ladder fuel concern. And, this makes me think about my trips to Tahoe, where it's not necessarily grazing, but they've started raking out things that used to be there, and now it's just trees with bare ground in between. Fob Dance, we're going to get to you. Jim Coda, we're going to get to you. And do you want to address the understory fuel real quick?
Well, there's several ways to address it. One, uh, a fire ecologist named Bill Baker wrote about this issue that I think there's something to consider. He says leaving multi age vegetation is your reassurance for the future.
Mm,
What he means by that is a lot of insects or diseases only attack certain age classes. So,
mm,
for example, in a lot of parts of the West, it's a big issue. I'm not going to talk about the oaks and madrone ecosystem that was mentioned, but I'll use this as an illustration. Lodgepole pine are susceptible to mountain pine beetle, but they
mm,
only attack the adults larger than usually than 10 to 15 inches. And so if you go in there and you eliminate all the younger lodgepole pine, you've eliminated that age class. And if they're and what often happens with the mountain pine beetle is that you get some of the adults are killed, and then the younger trees can grow very rapidly up into the canopy and replace those mature trees that were eliminated. But if you've gone in there and sanitized the site by eliminating all the younger trees, then you no longer have that generation there, and you may lose the mature trees, but you don't have any replacement. And I've been to places. I remember I was on a field trip in the Tetons one time, and we were looking at two lodgepole pine, and the researcher had aged both of them, and they were approximately the same size, but one was 150 years old and the other one was 40 years old. And the one that was 40 years old had been released after a pine beetle epidemic many years before and grew very rapidly, and so they had equal size. So that's one consequence of this. The other is this whole idea of that mortality, natural processes of mortality, whether it's wildfire, insects, and so forth, are things to be eliminated from the forest ecosystem. Yet
right,
those are the evolutionary processes
right,
that keep ecosystems healthy. And
right.
this is, so I read all the time about how we're going to go in there and we're going to thin the forest and we're going to, reduce the density or something like that to make the forest stand healthy. Natural processes do that much better.
Yeah,
A guy with a chainsaw doesn't know which trees, for example, are genetically adapted to drought or has more. And we have shown, I have to tell you scientifically, that there is diversity among any tree stand in their ability to say susceptibility to drought or to insects or whatever. Some trees are better at resisting mountain pine beetle, for example, in lodgepole pine. So you go in there and you do your thinning to reduce that because, oh my gosh, I don't want to have the forest stand get attacked by insects or maybe even wildfire. And you do not know by that process what you're eliminating from it. So it's an interesting thing. I hear about it all the time. We're going to increase the resilience of the forest by going in there and thinning and so forth, or doing a prescribed burn. But in fact, you do not. You're making the forest ecosystem, not just that stand of trees or that tree. You're making the ecosystem as a whole less resistant because you're eliminating the natural selective processes. A way to think about this, an analogy, is like wolves when they are in a landscape. They naturally choose the more vulnerable elk or deer in a population. That doesn't mean they don't occasionally get a real healthy elk or a real healthy deer, but percentage wise, if you look at it, you will see that they tend to go after the more vulnerable of the animals. And therefore, the elk herd or the deer herd overall is made healthier because the animals that are less fit are eliminated from that population. So these natural processes like disease, like wildfire, like drought, etc., are the wolves of the forest ecosystem, or the any ecosystem for that matter, and their ability to select certain individuals is different than what happens with human selection. And again, I'll make this analogy back with wildlife. You hear all the time from the hunting community that they're out there just taking the animals that would otherwise die. and that is really not true, because hunters tend to take the most productive and healthiest animals if they have a choice.
Mhm.
Whereas what the wolves or other predators, coyotes and so forth, tend to take the less productive animals. So human selection is different, and I can definitely say when you look at a forest ecosystem, they're going in there and trying to take trees that have commercial viability, and that is not the same necessarily as a tree that might be killed by drought or by insects or whatever. And so, most of these things, whether it's wildfire, whether it's insects, whether it's disease, are not 100% mortality when you look at a landscape scale. In other words, yeah, if you go on any particular acre of land, you might get 100% mortality, let's say, of lodgepole pine from mountain pine beetle. But you look at a whole hillside out there, and you'll see patches. You'll see individual trees as well as patches of trees that are not killed by the pine beetle. And that is partly, a lot of times, due to the resistance that those individual trees have that is not obvious, to
Yeah, and
the
then humans and their divine expertise come in and chop those trees down. They just
right.
remove the ones that developed the resistance. We
And
don't have a relationship. We have anointed ourselves with the knowledge and that we are the managers, but we don't even have a relationship with this land, such as the creatures that developed the system that you're talking about, which took thousands of years to develop.
exactly.
And we just step in and pretend like, or assume that we know, because we have anointed ourselves with the idea that we do know without having that relationship.
Well, you got to remember, almost all the plant communities here in the West have existed for millions of years. Plant species, and of course, at least in North America, humans have only been here 15, 20,000 years. It depends upon what studies you cite today. They're pushing back the dates as it goes, but still, it's insignificant in the evolution of these species. The human influence, many of the, I'll use ponderosa pine, for example. Ponderosa pine have existed as a species since the end of the dinosaur era, about 60, well, dinosaurs went extinct about 65 million years ago. Just a little past that point is when ponderosa pine separated as a separate species. So we have millions and millions of years that ponderosa pine existed in North America without humans to set fires or to log them or do anything to improve lodgepole pine, ponderosa pine stands. They existed all those years with just natural evolutionary processes operating on them. And so to me, it's incredible arrogance to think that we're going to do a better job and know better than what evolution has created here over time. And so we need to step back and realize that, I'm a realist. I'm a pragmatist. I realize we're going to do some manipulation to survive. All animals do. But I operate under the theory that we should minimize our impacts to as little area as possible, rather than thinking that we have some sort of insight that gives us permission to operate over a landscape scale and replacing or limiting natural processes.
This is an entirely separate show, but I can't help but at least throw in the nugget that you just described what's going to be done to Tamales Forest right next to Point Reyes National Seashore. It's too healthy, as my usual co-host Jack Gescheit would put. He's not very happy about this plan, and what you just described is a pretty big hole in the excuses that are being made to go in and what I would say damage that area. But that's a different topic. Continuing with comments from people who are listening, and Jim Coda is right after this one. Are you seeing invasive annuals getting deeper into forests due to logging operations? I have been suspect that artificial opening up of forests puts more flammable fuel deeper into forests. We sort of covered that, but it's worth saying again. I'll tell you, I see it. I've seen it in Tahoe, but you're here to listen to George. George, what have you seen?
One of the things that touches on, and I'm glad that point was brought up because I haven't mentioned this yet, is logging roads are one of the main vectors for the invasion of forest ecosystems, of diseases, as well as exotic plants like cheatgrass or other species like that, weedy species that are more flammable. And so that's documented. There are some. There's a tree species in Northern California. Oh God, what's it? Port Orford cedar that gets a root rot that's distributed by logging. It gets in the trucks and tires and then gets up into where the logging roads go in, and it's had a significant impact on Port Orford cedar, for example, mortality. So definitely. More it's the way that a lot of these plants get into an ecosystem and get established, and then they go from there. Another thing I might mention too, as far as forest fires go, this is another research thing. They find that the openings created by logging roads, because that area is not shaded, it becomes areas that are heated up faster and dry out the adjacent vegetation, which often is these exotic things like cheatgrass or other grasses and shrubs that burn more readily, so that any ignition spreads rapidly into the forest. And finally, because humans are one of the main sources of fire in, well, particularly California, but the whole West. And there's, again, research that shows the majority of all fires start within a couple of 100 feet of roads. So you have this irony that the agencies are building more logging roads so they can get in and thin the forest, so that they can reduce fires. But in creating more roaded access, they actually increase the likelihood or the probability of fire. And even if they, quote, close the road, closed roads are not 100%. Whether people can mountain bike or take a motorbike and go around it, or just walking. It's easier to walk on a closed road. So you're creating more access for humans into areas that otherwise wouldn't have human access or very limited human access.
Is it too pessimistic for me to say that you're really creating roads for the timber industry?
Well, of course, that's what it is. But the counter to that is they'll say, well, that allows us to get to the fire quicker. But you wouldn't have the fire in the first place, if you didn't have the road there in a lot of cases. So it's
we like to spend money fixing the problems that we create.
Exactly the same thing. I don't want to make too much of a political statement here, but it's like if the Iran war is ended, and the Strait of Hormuz is opened, and Trump
we're back to where we were before the war.
We're back to where we were. We created the issue in the first place, and then we'll take credit for fixing it. So,
are we even admitting that it's a war yet?
I don't know. It's an excursion. But anyway, that's an aside.
All right. Jim Coda, former environmental attorney working with Point Reyes National Seashore Issues, asks in a very level manner. NPS and TNC say they will try to restore the formal coastal prairie at Point Reyes by targeted grazing. Will that work? If not, what will work?
Well, I can't give you a clear answer on that because I'm not real familiar with coastal prairie ecosystems. However, targeted grazing is very difficult to implement, and it generally is the idea. Like I'll give you an example again on areas that I do know from, like the Great Basin and so forth. People say they're going to eliminate cheatgrass by targeted grazing, and the idea is we bring cattle in early when the cheatgrass is greening up, which is before the native grasses do. So we get the cattle to graze those cheatgrass, and we reduce the seed component to it. But that again ignores all the other collateral damage, the damage to the the soil crust. It ignores the disturbance that's created, which tends to favor, it's almost impossible to get rid of all the seed bank from cheatgrass. So
absolutely.
And then finally, you have to remember on a landscape scale, you can't do this any kind of large area. I mean, maybe you could do a couple of acres at a time or something like that. And if you were really diligent, you might make an impact that way. But you're not going to do it on any kind of many acres kind of a landscape and have the control that would do that. I don't know what would recover the coastal prairies there, except to say, give it time. I'll use again cheatgrass examples from the Great Basin. There are studies that will show you that when you eliminate grazing, the native grasses will tend to come back, but it may take decades because of what I mentioned earlier. In other words, they may only have a good year for seedling establishment every 20 years. So if you go in, 10 years after you eliminate grazing and you say, oh, there's no difference happening. Well, that's too short a time scale. Again, humans, we have this short-sighted way of looking at things. It might take 50 or 100 years for the native ecosystems to recover from the disturbance that's happened. And, we try to hasten that and speed it up. But a lot of times in doing so, we make things worse.
Well, you could see a flaw in trying to hasten it, but the other flaw is absolutely never achieving it using a program that is being marketed as trying to achieve it. Here's my simplistic version. You're the expert. I'm just the amateur that uses his eyes. Point Reyes National Seashore has had decades to restore this coastal prairie and have failed miserably. And what's been taking place during these decades of failure? Cattle grazing. Now, because you added the term targeted, cattle grazing is going to restore it? Come on, people. How? Well, and by the way, another point that you made that you touched on, you come in and eat the annual grasses when they're young and before they seed and whatever. This assumes that they don't keep trying to grow. This is one of the problems with these annuals from another place. They are opportunists and they are incredible survivors. They keep trying to grow. You give them a drop of water in the middle of the summer, a drop of water in the middle of the winter, a drop of water in the middle of the spring, that seed bank that you mentioned is going to react. You don't get rid of these things because you brought in cattle at a certain time. You don't. And every time you bring them back to try and solve the problem that I just mentioned, you're also preventing the native plants that desperately are trying to return. And as you pointed out, the cattle target them first. As I pointed out, the cattle target them first. You have a perpetual grazing program that never accomplishes anything and in fact prevents native plants from returning. But hey, that works out great for the ranchers because to have the cattle there, you got to spend money. And if you have the cattle there all year, the ranchers are getting paid all year. That's
let me explain another reason why you taking off from what you said. One of the things with targeted grazing is exactly that, as you mentioned. They also graze the more desirable grasses, usually the perennials.
Yeah.
And why does that harm the perennials? Well, the reason is because perennials, when they get grazed, they need the leaf surface. That's how a plant survives. So the plant goes, Mayday, Mayday, I need new leaves, that have been removed by the grazing. And so where does it get the energy from that? It takes it from its root system and it translocates carbohydrates up to grow new leaf material. And if that happens too frequently, then the next drought comes along and that plant doesn't have a root system that allows it to survive the drought. And this is one of the ways that overgrazing happens over decades, is that you get the gradual replacement of the native plants because of the continual removal of the leaf material. They can sustain some of it, like blue bunch wheatgrass, which is a common plant again in the Great Basin, takes up to 10 years to recover from one grazing episode. Well, if you're grazing it every year, like the targeted grazing is going to try to do, and you're indirectly grazing those more desirable plants, that's what the animals do first.
Yeah.
They take the plants that are most desirable, and then they get around to grazing the less desirable plants that may be there. So
I've already filmed this. I've already proven this early in the stage. I've gone out to Point Reyes each month so far this year where they're still grazing cattle, and on the side of the fence by the road, you can find native plants. You can find yarrow. You can find poppies. You can find plantain. On the side of the fence where the cattle are, none of it. But cattle are there. You know what are there? the annual European grasses. You're not wiping out the European annuals. You're wiping out the native plants.
That's
And
often
it's not a debate. Like, I'm showing it. It's not a debate. But Jim, if you're still here and you want to have a follow-up question, I'd be happy to throw it up on the screen. By the way, everyone, I have posted the link to Georgia's Grass Fires Are More Prevalent Than Forest Fires publication. George, do you take donations via, there is a donate link on Wildlife News, or direct donations for all the work that you do?
No, I don't get that. Just helps to sustain the administration of the Wildlife News and the Sage Step project that I'm board president of, but I don't get paid.
Okay, well, I'll throw up the donation link to the Wildlife News anyway, because you guys are always putting out great stuff. It's a little bit.
Well, we could use some help to we have Jonathan Ratner is sort of the administrator of the Wildlife News, and we're always looking for some money to kind of sustain his ability out there.
How come the TNC doesn't want to help you guys?
Just don't know.
Let's continue with some viewer comments. Jim, I'll watch for any of your follow-ups. Do you have any thoughts on the massification theory and fire frequency for the Northeast? I have been seeing a lot of discussion that the forests of the Northeast experienced frequent fire events. I can't speak on this.
I can. I know quite a bit about, okay. Northeastern forests, particularly, we're talking about like New Hampshire, Maine, Vermont, and places like that, Massachusetts. Fire was very infrequent there. In fact, some of the longest fire rotations you'll find in North America existed in those deciduous forests in the northeastern United States. There's been a bunch of research. What people argue is that the Native Americans did a lot of burning, but and this is true for the West too, what they found there is that it was very localized in effect. You can show certain areas that the fire frequency was higher than would otherwise occur. But as a landscape scale, it did not occur very frequently. And that's because if you go to the Northeast, it's very moist in the summertime. That's when most of the lightning occurs. And so fires don't readily,
exact opposite of here. The exact opposite here.
They don't take off if it's moist. And green things, which most of the Northeast is green forest, not conifers, tend to resist fire as well. The fire season in the East is a very small window, usually in the spring, when the snow is melted, there's dry leaves on the ground, but before the green up in the spring. You might have a few weeks there where the forest is vulnerable to burning. So the point being is the big answer is no, fire was not frequent there, except in some very specialized ecosystems like pine barren and so forth. And so to suggest that that you need to do any kind of manipulation of the Northeast forests is basically not based on the prevalent science of the area.
So if I'm reading this comment correctly, then now there's a new lie being pushed that there used to be frequent fires where there weren't, in order to, oh boy.
Well, that's true of the West too, I might add. I'll give you an example from California. That there's research done. There are any number of papers I could cite, but there's been a number of people that have looked at wildfire in the Yosemite National Park area. And yes, in the Yosemite Valley, there was, there were native villages there, and there was a higher frequency of fire in that valley, which only is 700 acres of the whole park, by the way. But what they found that at a local as well as a regional scale, the dominant factor in fire was from climate, and the conditions when there was drought and other conditions that favored fire is when you had fire in the rest of Yosemite National Park. So And that's true of all the research that I'm aware of from around the West. And what happens, and this so people are aware of, again, you got to look at the minutia here. You have people that want to advocate for more frequent fire, looking at that local scale. In other words, they will look at, say, the Yosemite Valley and extrapolate to the rest of the Sierra Nevada and say, well, look, we found fire was more frequent in the Yosemite Valley, therefore fire was more frequent in the whole Sierra Nevada range. And we could go to other areas. The Willamette Valley in Oregon, for example, probably had some of the highest population of Native people in the West because it was a mild climate. You had salmon resources, acorns, a lot of things that people could live on. And what they found, same thing, localized. Yeah, there's a little additive factor of human manipulation in the immediate area of villages and so forth, but not on the landscape as a whole. And so, to try to extrapolate when there's some burning of a few acres or, and try to say that this influenced whole landscapes is incorrect. And the other thing is we have lots of evolutionary evidence to the opposite effect. You put up a picture of sagebrush there, and I'll extrapolate on that. Sagebrush across the West, the common sagebrush species, have long fire rotations, 50 to 400 years between fires. So, and of course, sagebrush is a low elevation species around the West where people were living. And so you could say that if burning by humans was as common as people want to suggest, we would not have sagebrush because it can't tolerate frequent burning. And if we didn't have sagebrush, we wouldn't have sage grouse. We wouldn't have sage thrashers. We would not have sage sparrows. We wouldn't have pygmy rabbits and a whole lot of other species that are obligates of brush ecosystems. In other words, we have evolutionary evidence that fire could not have been so frequent in sagebrush ecosystems. And the similar thing I would say about chaparral in California, which, by the way, chaparral is one of the, by acreage, is one of the most common plant communities in California. And again, it cannot tolerate real frequent burning either. And we have lots of species that are more common in chaparral than in other areas, again, providing evolutionary evidence that these landscapes did not burn, millions of acres because they would not exist today if they had been burned that frequently.
Just a reminder for people, please go and read George's work. I'm going to read one sentence. The fastest moving 3% of wind-driven fires account for 88% of the damage to homes. I mean, that sentence alone is another episode to talk about. Thank you for being here, George. As the Coast Writer says, great guest, and that's why we're taking your comments. And Jim Coda has a follow-up. Bottom line, I don't think Point Reyes will ever return to its pre-European man-cattle condition, regardless of anything MPS or the TNC will do. Well, Jim, if you're still around, I would like to pose a question to you. What do you think would? What do you think would? You asked George what he thinks might. What do you think would? Obviously, not what the TNC and Point Reyes National Park staff are doing, but I'd love to have a little virtual conversation between you and George here about what might work and debate that.
Can I throw in something real quick here?
Yeah.
What I say might work is you have to allow the natural evolutionary processes to continue. Whatever, I can't predict what will be there in the future, and neither can anybody else. No. But as long as we allow the evolutionary processes to operate, we will get to the best situation.
We're not going to do that though, because we're managers.
That's the problem. But the example is we got a warming climate. That's our fault. But the fact is that what will survive in that warming climate will be determined by the climate. And so what plant communities and species are best adapted to those situations is what we will see. And so, to my mind, getting out of the way, so to speak, in other words, the degree that we can, and allow these natural processes to operate as the way to preserve these ecosystems and retain their ecological health.
Really quick, I'm just going to read Corinne's comment suggesting to read Laura Cunningham's latest piece in the Western Watersheds Project. But the main reason I put that up is that the TNC and Point Reyes National Seashore are ignoring someone who knows what they're talking about, suggestions about what to do in Point Reyes National Seashore. It's disturbing how it seems like the plan that's going to be adopted is always the plan that was going to be adopted, and it's a plan that supports ranchers. And that's what people kind of need to think about when the wildlife news and other organizations criticize the TNC. It kind of seems like they're that's not even a theory. They have a $1.5 billion annual budget, and a lot of their work goes towards actually helping ranchers.
That's correct. And by the way, Laura Cunningham is a real expert on Point Reyes. And
yes, she is.
You got to give her a lot of credit if you want to read.
You should, but the TNC won't.
Yeah.
But I'm sorry, I cut you off.
No, I just wanted to say that she's been following the issue for a long time and is real familiar with it.
Let's get Laura and George out to Point Reyes together. I'm going to put a fundraiser together. Boy, would that be an interesting piece, walking through there and looking at the lack of progress taking place thanks to this inherently flawed plan. Another viewer question. Wilson Forest Lands recently published a video about how Douglas fir trees are destroying our forests due to mismanagement, due to weedy behavior. Trees are acting like weeds, huh? I'm sorry, I'm going to skip that one. We'll come back to it. That's too infuriating. Do you feel this mismanagement is creating a negative feedback loop, i.e. the cumulative effects are hastening a larger collapse? My goodness, that's dark and accurate.
Well, definitely, as we're seeing with the spread of exotic grasses, I'm most familiar with the sagebrush ecosystems of the West, and sagebrush is suffering greatly, particularly because of cheatgrass and other invasives. There's other species out there that are, problematic as well, that are taking over, and they are being favored by the disturbance factor that comes with, particularly with livestock raising. And so, we're seeing a collapse of ecosystems in many cases due to the continued manipulation. I want to make a comment about the forestry too, by the way. There's research that shows in areas where you have, quote, active forest management, in other words, logging, you actually have higher severity wildfires than you have in places where you leave things alone. And there's a number of factors for that. One, you open up the forest to more drying when you do your thinning operation. You also bring in these logging roads, like I said, that are vectors for spread of weedy species. You also create a situation through the logging where the wind can penetrate more. And since wind is such a big factor in any large fire, and people know this themselves, go up on a ridge where the wind is blowing 50 miles an hour and stand in the open, you practically get laid down flat on the ground. And if you go where the trees are thick, it's almost like there's no wind at all. And so, it's obvious that the dense forests actually hinder wind penetration.
Yeah.
And so the active forest management tends to increase this. And the other thing with the active forest management, a lot of them I see, including the so-called thinning projects, tend to make even age stands that look like a plantation because you've eliminated the younger generation of trees and so forth. So you don't get this multi-age forest, which would be more resistant to various natural processes that might, eliminate some of the trees, but not all the trees.
I see Honest Doubter has joined us. Welcome to the show. Jim continues to be professional. I'm no expert. I'm just looking for answers. I've asked NPS and TNC in writing what will work and await their replies. Well, there's a message embedded there. The lack of replies, the inability to answer basic questions that are posed to them. I don't know if that's what Jim's trying to say, but that's what I'm going to extrapolate from that.
Yeah, and you know, and you should mention, Skyla, because you know more about this. But there's interference from the current administration trying to promote the grazing on Point Reyes, and I don't know about the individuals working for the Park Service there, but I would say in general, you have to recognize that political interference. You know, I, I know a lot of people that work for the federal government that disagree with the current management direction that they're being assigned to do more logging or more grazing or opening up in like on BLM lands, closed allotments that hadn't been grazed in decades. That's the direction they're getting from this administration. And even the people that are, you might say, moderately supportive of grazing on public lands don't necessarily think we should be opening up those closed allotments, because one of the benefits of those closed allotments is that's a control. And in science, you want to have places that aren't manipulated, and they have to be large scale. You know, it's a totally fake thing to like have 1 acre fenced and say, okay, this is our control over 100,000 acres. You want to have, you know, a 20,000 acre or 30,000 acre parcel with no grazing as your comparison. And that's what some of these closed allotments are. And that's what we could get at Point Reyes over time too. If we, you know, how most of the coastal areas are grazed, you know, because they're private ranch lands. We don't.
George, you just got to the bottom line. You can't allow the evidence to exist, because these closed areas are an example of this gradual, hey, humans, back off and let's see what happens over time, which we're not usually patient enough for, but a couple of these cases exist, and we're just about to have that evidence of progress, and they reopened it to grazing.
Yes.
And one of the problems with the goat grazing that I was trying to do is like, where's the control? Where's my comparison? Like, they are grazing everything. There's no opportunity for me to have a comparison. Well, the only areas that I found was where they accidentally forgot to graze the goats. And guess what I found? Conditions were better there than where they're grazing.
Well, another point, as I mentioned earlier, as a warning, is to make sure that your control where there's not grazing or logging is large enough. And that's where a lot of the, wilderness areas, for example, where there's no logging allowed, or most national parks don't allow logging, although that's changing under this administration too. But the manipulation areas, the controls are usually small, and that often doesn't make for a valid control. And so we need to really have much larger areas that are landscape scale areas that are set aside without that manipulation. And you got to give it a lot of time too, as I said, especially if it was exploited in the past. What we find in a lot of closed allotments, of course, is that they suffer from the impacts of past livestock grazing, and it takes decades in many cases for them to recover from that past manipulation. And so you can't go in there 10 years later and say, oh, we haven't had cows here for 10 years, and look, it's no different than the areas that are grazed, because the seed source has been eliminated, for example, or they haven't had a good year for seedling establishment even among the native grasses that might be left. So you have to give it lots of time, and it has to be large scale.
And again, I'm going to shout out Laura Cunningham really quick. She's basically just asking for a couple of control spots in Point Reyes National Seashore so that we at least have a comparison to find out if TNC's plan works. And they're not even acknowledging that. I mean, people, they're afraid of evidence to the contrary. That should be a warning sign to you. Let me read another viewer. Just because we can't turn back the clock does not mean that we can't use the ideal of a pristine ecosystem as a target to move toward. The vegetation of 500 years ago is a valid management goal. Yes, indeed. We should keep trying, even if the path is difficult. And we do have, it also makes me think about the fact that we do have examples of where things are healthy, and that's where cattle aren't. That same person says, I am seeing Cal Fire grinding up everything on the forest floor in huge 300-foot wide swaths, destroying the entire next generation of trees. As the old trees die, it will become a deforested area. And not even necessarily destroying the next generation of trees, but also sprawling ground cover that exists, that was growing where pine needles are. And it was obvious just from observation that this native, it was oak something, but it was like a ground cover with the oak name. I'm forgetting the name. This again is in Tahoe, where they've started sweeping the floors. But where they hadn't swept the floors, I saw the next generation of life. And guess what? Where that next generation of life was more moist. You know, it wasn't this barren, non-habitat system. And it also wasn't just baking under the sun, begging for a problem. But thank you for your comment.
I'll give another example. Years ago, I did a canoe trip up the Gila River in Arizona, which since that time has been protected as a national riparian conservation area. But when I did my trip up that, this gets to the point about tree age, I did transects on the gravel bars and showed that all the young cottonwood trees were getting eaten by cattle. And the only thing that was left there were large, what I call historic trees that established themselves before widespread cattle grazing had occurred there. And then once they kicked the cows out of that area, there's still trespass cattle I found in the area, but greatly reduced the amount of grazing. At the time I went up the river, you could walk across gravel bars all the way to, rock walls on the side. And then after the cattle were removed, it became so thick in places you couldn't leave the creek at all, the river bed at all, without running into a tangle of vegetation. And particularly for the birds in that region, that riparian habitat is very, very important. And, it is the most important habitat in the West. But anyway, the point is that with the cattle grazing, we didn't get that next generation of cottonwood until the cattle were eliminated. Now you have multi-generational plants there, from young seedlings all the way to the historic trees that were left behind.
Not until the cattle were removed. My goodness, how can that sentence exist while organizations like the TNC are saying we need the cattle? It's amazing. I'm continuing to throw links up on the screen. The link I just threw up is to the publication that I am quoting the most today. Another great one from George Wuerthner, which I could go sentence by sentence and we could have an entire episode. I'm also putting the donation link for the wildlife news up there. And I've got this ongoing donation for my own, thanks to Trump's war. I can't afford gas to even go up to Point Reyes. But so asking for gas money. Let's keep documenting the destruction of Point Reyes that is being presented as restoration. One more thing, at least one more. This is something. Reducing carbon sequestration at this propaganda fest that, as you mentioned, this administration is favoring the ranchers. Well, they had that woman from the Department of the Interior out there, and they had all this propaganda there talking about reducing wildfires, and they even claim that these annual cheat grasses are forms of carbon sequestration, which is just absurd. And I think this is a screenshot I took from this latest piece that you wrote. In addition to contributing to more frequent fires, cheatgrass hampers the ability for these large grassland and sagebrush areas to store carbon. Healthy, intact native grasslands have been found to be very good at sequestering carbon. Again, growing stages for people like me. If you were like how I was about 10 years ago, maybe you thought that forests were what we need for carbon sequestration. It turns out these grasslands and brush areas are actually extremely important in both
Well,
grass, but their roots, how shockingly different are native perennial grass roots compared to these annuals that they're claiming sequester carbon, George?
well, that's the point. Native grasses, particularly the perennials, have 90% of their biomass is usually in the root system. So, and that root system,
90%.
yeah, and that root system is what's storing the carbon. Yet annuals have very shallow roots, limited.
Very.
They're ready to take care of exploit water in the top layers of the soil, and in fact, studies that suggest that livestock grazing increases carbon storage. Here's another one of those little nuances. They usually are only looking at the top layer of the soil, not the in-depth layers. And yeah, you could,
Which is the layer that the cattle are going to destroy anyway, right?
well, but I was going to say, the cheatgrass have their bulk of their roots in that top soil part,
Right.
whereas the native grasses are much deeper. So if you're just measuring that top layer of soil, you might actually show there's more carbon there, but it is not stored long term because it's much more vulnerable to drought, and cheatgrass come in thicker when there's a lot of moisture.
That screams intentional dishonesty. Who would
Well,
just go out and measure the top part?
well, that's just the way it is, and I'm just giving you the examples of what you have to
I
be
know you
looking
are.
at is how these science is conducted. And so they're not inaccurate. In other words, what I'm trying to say is when they measure something like that, they may not be giving you misinformation of what they found, but they're not giving you all the information you need to evaluate this situation. And so the car, and the other thing that they never consider is the emissions from the cattle themselves. In the digestion, any benefit to carbon storage that may be increased, and I'm being generous here because I don't think there's too many examples, but any place where you could even assert that grazing increased carbon storage has to be countered against the emissions. And every study that I know that has ever looked at that shows that the emission from the cattle digestion greatly exceeds any amount of carbon that is additional carbon stored as a result of livestock grazing.
Wow.
So you cannot just say that this is an overall benefit. Again, you have to look at the bigger picture. And domestic livestock are one of the major sources of carbon emissions worldwide. And, if I were going to make a plea to anybody, that is to eat less beef, because beef, and dairy products are a very large source of the carbon emissions globally. And we need to understand that that's one of the ways that individually we could make a choice that would reduce carbon. And
ladies and gentlemen, that's coming from a non-vegan, by the way. This audience is accustomed to myself and my co-host who eliminated animal products some time ago. This is someone who is not that way, who can still acknowledge the importance of removing that from your diet, or at least reducing it.
Yeah, and then the same thing, by the way, I'll mention about forestry too. The biggest source of carbon emissions in Oregon comes from the wood products industry. In other words, thinning the forest, actually, that emits more carbon than all the transportation in Oregon, the cars, the airplanes, etc. And
this is Oregon right here, right?
Yeah, no, that picture was taken in the Black Hills of South Dakota, but. But any place that you're doing logging, the wood products industry releases more carbon. And carbon is released by wildfires, but a much smaller percentage, because what burns in a wildfire? It's the fine fuels. It's the needles, the cones, and so forth. And most of the carbon remains as snags and roots in the ground. And so the logging industry releases far more carbon on a per acre basis than a wildfire does. So again, leaving intact forests is a good way to store carbon. And right now we need to store carbon in the long run. Gradually, as trees die, they release carbon as they rot, but it may take 100 years or more for all that carbon to be released. whereas you get a much more immediate release by doing the logging. So that's our problem for today, is to try to reduce that. And on a global situation, if you do a full accounting of the emissions from livestock production, and when I say full accounting, for example, in tropical areas, a lot of forest is being logged over to make new pasture for livestock. Well, that when they eliminate that forest, they're eliminating carbon storage, because trees store far more carbon than the grasslands do. So that's where, on a global scale, livestock production is a major problem.
Corinne, thank you for your super chat. Appreciate that. We have a tongue-in-cheek comment. Buy a live Christmas tree. It's way more environmentally friendly. Are they actually saying that? Monocultures in the arid West that get clear-cut and harvested by helicopters. Yeah, highway, 92 between 101 and the coast has these Christmas tree monocultures. They're pretty depressing to see. But yeah, are they actually promoting those as being more environmentally friendly than what? Than reusing a plastic tree? I guess neither or both. Maybe we just let go of stupid traditions.
Well, I gotta say, I had a roommate years ago who she persuaded us to put a snag up as our Christmas tree. And
what's a snag?
A dead tree, just the dead branches, and then hang Christmas ornaments.
Like the Charlie Brown, isn't that in the Charlie Brown video?
Yeah, it wasn't quite as attractive as a regular Christmas tree, but anyway, but we put the ornaments and the bulbs on it, and made it work.
Last chance for listeners to pose your questions, because we're going to wrap up pretty soon. George has already given an hour and a half of his time. It's all been excellent. Appreciated it all. Two things that, George and I have talked about this a lot over multiple years, and two things that after all those years that I never talked about with you was the resource consumption of these annuals that grow quickly and rapidly, and what that means they're taking from the natives, as well as we didn't talk that much about the carbon sequestration difference. And these are all extremely important. And yet the truth that we are revealing here on the show, the exact opposite of that, is being promoted by the Point Reyes National Park Service, the Nature Conservancy, and the ranchers out there pretending. These people, I have a hard time believing that they don't know that what they're saying isn't true.
I do too. And I think that you have to recognize the political and financial incentives that are out there to just, like I said, particularly scientists. Most scientists don't lie because their whole reputations depend upon that. But the kind of questions they ask make a difference in what they find out, of course. And as I mentioned, for example, there are studies on the Great Plains that show that grazing tends to increase carbons in the upper layer of the soil, as I mentioned. Because blue grama, which is resistant to grazing, it's a sod-forming thing, planted, it tends to do better under grazing impacts. But if you were to, so a scientist wouldn't be lying when it measures that top layer of soil and finds maybe there's more carbon there than in areas that aren't grazed, because where they aren't grazed, you have more of the plants that have deeper roots. And they're storing
they produce the carbon.
Storing more carbon in the soil if you look at the whole soil profile. So they're not lying when they find it, but they are not telling you that other part of the story. So you got to be aware of what are the right questions to ask.
Oh, good stuff. You wrote a lot. I don't want to overwhelm with one day. Anything that you would like to mention before we wrap it up that I didn't bring up myself?
Well, I re-emphasize this whole idea that we have very few large areas on the Pacific coast there in California, in Marin County or whatever, that aren't under livestock production. And
Yep.
that makes Point Reyes even more important as being a place where there is no livestock production. So, I've had people argue, oh, well, we need to produce milk in Point Reyes or whatever it is because, and it's like, are you kidding? Most of California that can be grazed is grazed
Yep.
or is pasture land for
Yep.
livestock. So we
Yep.
don't need to preserve more areas for livestock production. We have plenty of private lands where that's ongoing and it's probably going to continue to ongo for into the future. So that makes places like Point Reyes absolutely far more valuable as a non-grazed area. So people keep that in mind. We need more areas, large landscape areas, not, a little 100-acre exclosure here and there where there's no grazing. We need entire landscapes, which Point Reyes represents, where we eliminate that human exploitation influence to the greatest degree possible and let nature operate on an evolutionary scale. And that, to me, would be my hope for the future.
Point Reyes National Seashore Peninsula produces a minuscule amount of dairy and beef that people consume, period, no matter who you are. But I took that a step further, George, and I went to all the stores in the surrounding towns and looked at the products. They're not even providing local food. They're not even selling products out of Point Reyes National Seashore locally, and yet people want to jump on the local food bandwagon. I mean, no aspect of it is true.
Right. Well, yeah. Again, keep in mind that California has, I believe it's 5 million livestock. It has one of the largest livestock herds, you might say, in the western states. So, there's plenty of places being grazed in livestock. By livestock. And then if you add in the areas that they're growing pasture, like you go down into the Imperial Valley and places like in the desert where they're growing alfalfa that they, cut 2, 3, 4 times a year. All that land that's being used, that's livestock production too. Even those areas aren't being grazed necessarily like cattle, but they're growing cattle food. And so the majority of the agricultural land in California, majority of it is used either as pasture or as irrigated crop land to feed livestock. So,
Yep.
Even in California, I mean, people forget, even though California is one of the biggest agricultural producers in the United States, producing more nuts, fruits, wine, or whatever, that is actually a small part of the agricultural landscape in California. Livestock production is the single biggest use of agricultural lands in California. And so, and we don't need it. I mean, or we could use a lot less of it. There are plenty of sources of protein that are non-meat at all. Or if you're going to eat meat, there are sources of protein that are less impactful than cattle grazing. And so, you can make that choice in the food you eat. And I think that's, I wrote an essay years and years ago. So with the title, how to fix the landscape with your fork. The idea of your food selections make a big difference on what happens to the landscape. And so keep that in mind.
Keep that in mind, everybody. And there's a lot more to talk about in that. Thank you, George, so much for being here. Your work is invaluable, and I hope that we can have you on again in the future. I hope we can get you out to Point Reyes. Does that interest you? If we can?
Oh yeah, I've been hoping that I was going to come down this spring, but I had a family issue that prevented me. But yeah, in the future, particularly in the spring, I always like to go down the coast of California in the spring. It's so beautiful, and Point Reyes is one of the stops I like to make.
Oh, and for any people who are not on my side of this issue listening, I pose a challenge to you. Where do you think I should go hike in Point Reyes National Seashore in order to find an example of healthy native habitat? Because I don't want people accusing me of biasly choosing where I go. I'm trying to find anywhere that has an impressive native biodiversity representation. And warning, I'm going to follow it up by whether or not there are cattle there. So pick and choose carefully, ranchers who respond to this. I'm guessing you won't respond because there aren't any native habitat areas that have cattle grazing, but you can give it a try and I'll go look. And thank you everybody who came out, Corinne, etc., who came out to the shark presentation, my other personality when I'm not talking about livestock in San Francisco. I wanted to give you guys a shout out for coming. And again, I've posted the links multiple times to go and support George, to read his work and support me as well. George, it was a pleasure. I hope to see you again soon.
Thank you, Skylar. Okay, we'll see you.
All right, bye.